Welcome to session 6, Leadership and Change, our last session. We started off with the strategy planning, we moved into strategy execution. Those two things actually need strategic leadership. Who are the leaders in the organization who make sure that the company has a sound strategy and the strategy gets executed? So in this session, we're going to look at the key features of the company's corporate culture, which is very important for strategy execution or for getting things done within the organization. The role of the company's core values and ethical standards in building the corporate culture. How and why a company's culture can aid the drive for proficient strategy execution. The kinds of actions management can take to change a problem corporate culture. Some companies have a toxic corporate culture and they have to do something to change that. What constitutes effective managerial leadership in achieving superior strategy execution? The issues of adaptability. As we've been talking about, the context that is ever changing. Companies operate in an environment that is quite volatile, complex, uncertain, and it changes all the time. And they need to adapt and come up with emergent strategies. Lesson 6.1, the culture. We often hear that the statement that culture will eat your strategy for breakfast. What does that mean? It means your culture can undermine your good intentions, your good strategy that you've drafted. So even if that strategy is very good and you are attempting to execute it well, but the culture could easily undermine that. So instilling a corporate culture conducive to good strategy execution is not easy. Corporate culture refers to the shared values ingrained in attitudes, core beliefs, company traditions that determine the norms of behavior accepted, work practices, and styles of operating. So a corporate culture is the meshing of shared values, beliefs, business principles, and traditions that imbues a company's operating style, behavioral norms ingrained in attitudes, and work atmosphere. Is important because it influences companies' action and approaches to conducting business. It's not very easy to change a company's culture. It's very difficult. It requires very strong leadership to drive corporate culture. But the starting point is to understand what exactly is the prevailing culture within the organization. Strong guiding principles drive high performance culture. And we'll take a case of a company, let's call it Softcore, which was a software company. What actions does this company take to foster the high performance culture that is so important to its success? How does the company drive its 10 commandments? They came up with what they call the 10 commandments related to its stated principles. Is there a relationship between development of unique culture and subsequent growth and success of focused on niche businesses? So we'll look at this case study to see how the principles they set together with what they call the 10 commandments, how those two things interrelated. The 10 commandments, they establish that do not go public. As one of the things they didn't want to expose themselves to is to get listed. Do not be acquired. They'll do everything possible to make sure that they remain a private company and it doesn't get swallowed by a bigger corporate, which in turn might even lead them to being a public entity. Software must work. Expectations should be reality. Keep commitments to your customers. Have standards. Be fair. Teach philosophy and culture, meaning practice what you preach. Keep on talking about the culture within the organization. Every decision, every action should be conveying the culture of the organization. They also had principles such as make our products a joy to use. So as you can see, the commandments and the principles, They are more or less the same, whereas some are more about the culture and the others are more about business. But they saw those two things as intertwined. Have fun with customers. When you service your customers, you need to create an experience, what we talked about. And that experience can come from you trying to have fun with your customers. Design collaboration with users. So some users of the software, find a way to collaborate with them, what we call in marketing co-creation, because that's how you get feedback from your users about the future improvements on your software or on the tool that you can implement. Improve the patient's health and healthcare experience. Some of their software was geared for health industry. Therefore, that principle relates to that they need to improve the patient's health and healthcare experience, which is part of their value proposition. Do what is difficult for us if it makes things easier for our users. This is a very strong principle to say. Don't take a short route, don't take a shortcut, even if it's difficult, as long as it's going to please the customer in the end. That is very important. You should go through that pain because that's how you're going to retain customers. And follow process, find root cause, fix processes. As we said, that processes are not static, they are dynamic, so they need to evolve. As things change, your processes have to change accordingly, which is part of your resources and capabilities. And we did talk about dynamic capabilities that needs to evolve as the environment is evolving. So you'll find that the principles they adopted, together with their 10 commandments they lived by, they are quite related and intertwined, which is what informed the way of doing things within the organization. 8 key features of a company's corporate culture are values, principles, and ethical standards in actual use, management practices and organizational policies. This is very important because policies, to some extent, they guide behavior within the organization. But if your policies communicate bureaucracy, that will be the culture that will creep into your organization. The atmosphere and spirit embodied in the company's work climate. The spirit, it could be the way we sit in the canteen and who's got access to what. All those things communicates what is the culture that prevails within the organization. How managers and employees interact and relate to one another. Do you all go to the same canteen, or you find that management has got a separate kitchen or canteen, the rest of the workers go to a different canteen? Already that creates a gap when it comes to communication between the two groups, workers and management. In a lot of companies where they want communication to flow between workers and management, you find that they all go to the same canteen. As an example, strength of peer pressure to conform and observe norms. You will find that in self-contained projects, peer pressure plays a huge role, especially if you provide incentives for the group. The other members will put pressure on one particular team member who's not pulling his weight, and they will use peer pressure to achieve that. That way, you don't necessarily need formal processes to get people to act in a particular way. Other members of the team will make sure that one team member who's not in the line then has to correct that behavior. Actions and behavior encouraged and rewarded. Your reward system communicates what is important within the organization. In a lot of companies, values are simply a list of those values and a plaque on the wall, and they don't form part of the performance contract. And we know the principle that what gets measured gets done. So if your values are not part of your performance contract, it's very difficult for people to actually observe and live the values of the organization. There has to be consequences against those who do not live the values of the organization. Culture also includes traditions and stories and how we do things around here. From time to time, those stories that we tell, whether it's during staff communication or in the canteen, they reflect exactly how things are done within the organization, or what are the values of the organization or the culture, how the firm treats its other stakeholders beyond the employees and the customers. You also have regulators, you have partners. How you treat them reflects the culture of the organization. So all of these are different elements that reflect the culture of the organization. And whenever you want to determine the culture, you have to go through this process and look at the stories that are being told, the way they treat other stakeholders, what gets rewarded and what gets punished from a behavior point of view. A company's culture is grounded in and shaped by its core values and ethical standards. A company's stated core values and ethical principles foster a work climate where company personnel share common and strongly held convictions about how the company's business is to be conducted, and two, provide company personnel with guidance about how to do their jobs, steering them towards both doing things right and doing the right things. So, those are the major elements of a corporate culture. A company's value statement and code of ethics communicate expectations of how employees should conduct themselves in the workplace. It starts with recruitment. Your screening of the applicants already gives you an opportunity to identify behaviors that are required within the organization. Even when they go through the orientation program, you have to reiterate the messages as to these are the behaviors that are expected within the organization. And this has to happen frequently beyond the orientation period. And you need managers who are serving as role models to lower level employees as to what behaviors are required within the organization. If it's good for the managers or it's good for the employees, it should also be good for the managers. You don't want a situation where you want people to do what you say but not what you do. You've got to walk the talk also, especially for managers, because they are typically the role models within the organization. That's who the lower level employees look up to get guidance. So they need to walk the talk as role models. Furthermore, you need to reward those who exhibit the behavior that reflects the cultural norms of the organization. Stress that the line manager all the way down to the first level supervisor give ongoing attention to explaining the desired cultural traits and behaviors in their areas where they have control. So it means apart from being a role model, they need to be paying attention and emphasizing the need to live the values of the organization, and even reward that and recognize those who live the values of the organization. Encourage the company personnel to exert strong peer pressure on co-workers. We often underestimate the role of peer pressure. If you have individuals within a team that are exhibiting certain behaviors, you need to work through them or with them so that you can put pressure on other individuals within that team who needs to change their behavior to the desired behavior. And peer pressure is very important. Why? Nobody wants to feel that they are dragging the team or pulling the team down. Therefore, peer pressure plays a role in that respect. That those who are exhibiting the behavior, then they will call out those who are not. And you should reward and celebrate those who are living the values of the organization. through some ceremonies, or if you have employee communication kind of activities within the organization, then you should use such platforms to communicate and name those who are living the organizational values. They deeply ingrain, you need to deeply ingrain the stated core values and high ethical standards. Companies must turn them into strictly enforced cultural norms. What are the forces that cause a company's culture to evolve? Causes of cultural change can be new or revolutionary technologies, diversification into new businesses, rapid growth of the organization, a merger and acquisition of another company, shifting internal conditions, and new challenges in the marketplace. This is very much in line with the stuff that we've already discussed, that changes take place in the macroeconomic environment or in the marketplace. To some extent, that can compel the organization to adjust internally in terms of its culture. Sometimes you acquire another company which also has its own its own culture. So when you bring the two companies together, there is a culture that will ultimately win, or both cultures will get diluted, which means a new culture will emerge. But such new culture may be made out of certain elements from both cultures. When you acquire in a company, it's not it doesn't result that or automatic that your culture will prevail, because you may be acquiring a company that's got a very attractive culture to the extent that it influences your own culture, that your employees now adopt the culture of the company that has been acquired. Another driving factor, it will be the technology. As the companies roll out new technologies like social media for advertising purposes, a new culture all of a sudden will emerge. Things like how people communicate. In the past, they had to go through their managers to get to the executives. These days, with technologies, they could easily put a message where they know that even the executives will see that message without necessarily having to go through gatekeepers such as their supervisors or managers. So, all of these things contribute to the cultural change in the organization, or how the culture will ultimately evolve. It's also subjected to all these different changes. Clearly, if the change is rapid and it happens often, you might end up in a situation where there is a lot of confusion within the organization as to what exactly are the expected behaviors within the organization. In which case, then, this is where you need to keep on communicating that these are the values we have to live by within the organization, and they should guide our behavior, especially when things are changing very fast. That's when you really need values. Of course, you need values all the time, but when things are changing, the one thing that can ground employees and keep their heads in the right space, it's values of the organization. You are faced with a situation in an organization that you've got a strong culture versus a weak culture. In a strong culture, company, deeply rooted values and norms of behaviors are widely shared and regulate how the company conduct its business. So that is the case of a strong culture. However, on the other side, you've got a weak culture where the company lacks values and principles that are consistently preached or widely shared. This happens where you have managers who don't seem to have cohesion when it comes to the behavior. A different manager leads his or her own team in a particular way, another manager does his or her own thing, and there doesn't seem to be some commonalities. Then in that way you have a weak culture, and it creates a lot of problems, especially when it comes to things like decision making. When an employee is faced, for instance, with an irate customer who's not happy with the service provided. At that time, the employee needs to be guided by values as to be what would be the appropriate action to take in order to handle the customer or address their need or their concern. A weak culture has few or no traditions, beliefs, values, common bonds, or behavioral norms. If you remember the previous slides where we talked about the various elements that we can use to identify or profile the culture within the organization. So this means that, let's take stories for instance. You meet this one particular manager, the stories they tell you communicate one thing. And then in another team, when you talk to them, all of a sudden they are also telling you a totally different story that could even be in conflict with the other stories or stories you had from the other team. This is where you have a very weak culture, where there is no consistency when it comes to the message as well as the behaviors that managers and a whole lot of other employees exhibit within the organization. A strong culture is developed by a founder or a strong leader with strong values as well as a commitment by the company to ethical behavior. So when a founder starts a company, typically they will instill the values they want into the organization by even hiring people who seems to believe in similar values, and then they exhibit those values. That way then those values right from the start, they get entrenched within the organization. It doesn't mean they can't be changed. Yes, over time they can be changed, especially when the environment within which the company is operating changes and they have to adjust their values to match the new context. They can be changed through certain actions, such as you now reward a new behavior. So in the performance contract, you will specify the kind of behaviors you want and perform things like 360-degree evaluations of individual, and those who exhibit the behavior you want or the new behavior you want, then they'll be rewarded, which is a way of setting an example for the rest of the organization as what behavior will be rewarded and what behavior will be punished. A strong culture that encourages actions, behaviors, and work practices that are in sync with the chosen strategy and conducive to good strategy execution is a valuable ally in the strategy execution process. This goes back to the issue of strategy and the fact that there is that statement that culture will eat your strategy for breakfast. Therefore, for you to successfully execute your strategy, you need to cultivate the correct culture or the conducive culture, values, norms, behaviors within the organization that are in support with your strategy. For instance, if your strategy is all about quality, it means internally, even if you are providing services among yourself internally, you've got to exhibit that behavior and say, we care enough to deliver quality even to our colleagues, which means then it will be easier for you then to deliver quality to your customer, external customers, because you're already exhibiting that internal. As an example, IT department providing services to the rest of the company, they should also show that they believe in quality if that is part of your strategy. By so doing, it means that everybody within the organization is conscious about quality in this respect. I can use the same example with cost. Let's say you are a low cost provider. It means within the organization, people need to be conscious of every little cent. So they can't just spend internally because they are saying, this is internal, we print reports. It will mean that sometimes the reports don't have to be printed. They can be circulated in a digital format as a way of saying we control our costs here because we are a low cost provider. If we have a low cost structure, then we can pass the benefits on to our customers as low prices. So internally, we've got to be conscious of that fact that we need to contain our costs. That way you really make your values and the behavior live within the organization, not just a list of items with a plaque on the wall that says, in this place we believe in open door policy. And yet when there's bad news, managers are nowhere to be seen to handle the bad news. It is in management's best interest to dedicate considerable effort to establishing corporate culture that encourages behaviors and work practices conducive to good strategy execution. So managers, it's their responsibility to cultivate a culture that is well matched to the chosen strategy. As I've just explained in the previous slide, that if your chosen strategy, let's say it's turnaround time, it means even internally, you should be particular about turnaround times between the team members or between divisions, because that way that will translate in your turnaround time to your external customers. So if you are slow internally, the chances are very high that you be even more slow providing a service to an external customer. So it starts internally. Culture-induced peer pressure further induces personnel to do things in a manner that aids the cause of good strategy execution. So all of this center around strategy execution. Good culture, conducive for strategy execution, that's what you need to strive for. High performance cultures have a commitment to achieving stretch objectives and accountability. So from time to time, business leaders, they'll opt to stretch their targets. Let's say they said we're going to achieve growth of 5%, but if we come up with some very clever strategies, let's stretch that to 15%. Sometimes that stretch target could actually be a motivating factor amongst the employees, because when they reach that target, it gives them the confidence that almost anything is achievable, nothing is impossible. However, if the stretch is too much, you can actually serve as a demotivator to employees, because they'll look at that number and say, the economy is growing at 2% and management wants us to grow at 15%. Where would we get that extra 13%, given that we have so much competition in the marketplace? There are new players coming in, there are substitute products. How are we able to achieve such a target? It looks steep, but maybe your stretch target could just be 8% when the economy is growing at 3%. Employees will be motivated, perhaps under those circumstances, to achieve the 8%. So adaptive cultures have a willingness to accept change and take on challenges, just like your stretch targets. Both contribute to good strategy execution and performance. As a company's strategy evolves, an adaptive culture is a definite ally in the strategy implementing and strategy executing processes, as compared to cultures that are resistant to change. Because strategy execution, especially emergent strategies that you develop because of changes in the macroeconomic environment. So can you imagine if your culture doesn't match that? So you could have some individuals within the organization who have absorptive capacity, which means as leaders, they are able to discern what's happening in the macroeconomic environment and then change and adjust the strategies and tactics according. So can you imagine, after all that exercise, they get undermined by the corporate culture? That could be disheartening as well as demoralizing the employees. Therefore, you need to be paying attention to your culture at all times. Unhealthy cultures include politicized cultures, change-resistant cultures, incom- incompatible subcultures. So you'd find that you have a corporate culture and the values, but teams tend to have certain subcultures. Think of a company that has grown through acquisitions. So you look at the company like GIBS, that's got 300 plus companies within the group. As much as you have an overarching GIBS culture, that was very much driven by Mr. Brian Joffy while he was still running GIBS. As the founder of that organization, he instilled certain behaviors within the organization. But as the company was growing and acquiring a whole lot of other companies, then you have multiple subcultures within the group. After all the companies that are being acquired, they come with their own cultures. So in some instances, those subcultures stick because you've got strong individuals who believe in those behavioral norms as much as they can adjust to also match the corporate culture. You can't totally eliminate subcultures. It's not easy. So it does happen. And unethical and greed driven cultures are also part of those cultures that are a bit of a problem. Insular, inwardly focused cultures are a problem within an organization. This type of cultures lead to poor strategy execution and poor performance. So culture plays a huge role. It can undermine your strategy, or it can actually serve as a catalyst for you to execute your strategy and achieve your performance targets. To drive change in the culture of the organization is the role of the top leadership. A strong, out of sync, or unhealthy culture must be changed in order to execute strategy successfully. And that's the role of a leader. So once you have identified that the culture within the organization is undermining your strategy, you need to make every effort to change that culture. You look at companies like Altron as an example. Teto Nyati is driving change in the way the company was run before and instilling certain behaviors that do not undermine, rather, that are very supportive to the strategy he has set for the organization. Competent leadership at the top is necessary for cultural change effort to succeed. And this is necessary. Like the examples I've given you, whether it's Aldron, Telcom, or Transnet, it doesn't matter. A lot of companies, especially the ones that are struggling, you find that they'll bring a new CEO who can then come in and identify, first formulate a strategy, then identify the behaviors that are necessary to drive that strategy. And they'll try to then implement that and instill that within the organization using the same techniques that we have already discussed. Kotter has an 8-step transformation process. It starts with establishing a sense of agency. If we use South Africa as an example, or we can even call it SA Incorporated, when Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa came in as president of the country, the first thing he needed to do was to create a sense of agency, which to some extent he did, to show people that from now on it's going to be business unusual. You need to create that sense of agency, especially when the company is not performing well. You don't have the luxury of saying you're still trying to understand. You need to hit the ground running and create a sense of agency. Some people call it a burning platform. Step number 2, form a powerful guiding coalition, which means find a small team that exhibit the behavior you want. Go for quick wins, and that team becomes the guiding coalition that ultimately everybody will look up to. Then create a vision, because you need the direction. You need to create a vision. For instance, Mr. Ramaphosa needs to come up with a vision and say, this is what we want to achieve for South Africa. Eliminate poverty. You could easily say that. But how long will it take to eliminate poverty in South Africa? Especially now you've got this prevailing market conditions. It won't be easy. Then communicate that vision. That is self-explanatory. That if you set the vision, you need to communicate it very regularly and make sure that people understand what the vision means, what that vision means. Very key. Then empower others to act on the vision. Again, it goes back to the issues of giving people responsibility as well as authority to make decisions. That way you will get a better response from your employees. Great short-term wins, just like I said, when we were talking about creating or forming a powerful guiding coalition. That guiding coalition then can drive the concept of identifying short-term wins within the organization. There is no better progress, or rather, there is no better motivator than progress. When people saw progress and you build a momentum, they become very excited. And that's how they will drive change within the organization. Consolidate the gains and build more change. So as we gain ground, keep on pushing for further change until you have achieved the transformation you want. But as a leader, since you have limited time, you've got to institutionalize that particular change. Just the same way as when Steve Jobs came back to Apple the second time around, he institutionalized innovation. He transformed the organization driven by innovation, and he inculcated that concept within the organization and institutionalized it. Even when he passed on, then the company was still able to come up with the innovations that are driving growth. That is very important, to institutionalize success. Success should not be dependent on the leader. Hence, we normally say good leaders replicate themselves. They realize that change needs to be driven throughout the entire organization, and you've got to institutionalize it. So those are the 8 steps that Kotter proposes when it comes to leading transformation. And he has written a book, Leading Change, which is given the environment that is ever changing. So what are the levers of change? In conclusion, a compelling case for change. Remember, I said you need to sell to your employees as to why they need to change. Challenging what is being taken for granted within the organization, because there is a lot in a company that will be taken for granted. It's your role to challenge that. And of course, change your policies and processes, including the routines within the organization, to communicate the now desired behavior. The symbolic management. As managers, you are role models to those you lead. Therefore, you need to exhibit the behavior that you want out of them, meaning walk the talk, instead of the issue of saying, do as I say, not as I do. People copy more what you do than what you say. Power and political systems within the organization can easily be a catalyst for organizational change, or at the same time, they could actually become a deterrent. Therefore, you need to pay specific attention or special attention to power and political systems within the organization. That's how you drive change and transformation within the organization. Lesson 6.3. Throughout this course, we've been referring to the business environment, the context that is ever changing, and these days it changes very fast. And we expect business leaders to discern that environment and adapt to it. So, adaptability is very key in managing business. After all, when that environment changes, business leaders are supposed to come up with emergent strategies to get back on course. So leading the strategy execution process, it's a very, very tough exercise, in a sense that it needs leaders with absorptive capacity, which is a company's ability to identify, assimilate, transform, and apply valuable internal, external knowledge, what they are getting out of the external environment, implement that as a way to respond to that particular environment. Put another way, absorptive capacity is a limit to the rate or quantity of scientific or technological information that a company can absorb. But of course, who absorb that information? It's actually the leaders or at any level within the organization. They will absorb those details and then use them internally in order to adapt their strategies to the ever-changing environment. Leading strategy execution requires leaders who stay on top of what is happening and closely monitor the progress. We are back then at monitoring the progress, which means then you have to go back to the performance target that you had set, see how close you are at achieving them. And if you are not achieving them or you are falling behind, you need to diagnose as to what exactly is the problem. And in most cases, the problem comes from the external environment and the ability to respond to that external environment. After all, that environment imposes opportunities as well as threats. So either you're not countering the threats that the environment is imposing, or you're not capitalizing on the opportunities out there. They will still have, both elements will still have a negative effect on your performance. But most importantly, what really delivers that sucker punch, it's actually the threats coming from the external environment. Putting constructive pressure on the organization to execute the strategy well and achieve its operating excellence. It's part of your strategy execution process. So it should be a constructive pressure to make sure that people are always paying attention to the targets that you want to achieve and doing what is necessary to move the company in the right direction. You also need to initiate corrective actions to improve strategy execution and achieve the targeted performance. So there is a performance and you have a strategy that you need to execute to achieve that performance. You need to come up with corrective action all the time. And don't forget, also sometimes challenges come from within, in a sense that There are certain decisions that you make. They may not be the ideal decision, but at what point did you then make a decision that this is not the good decision that we've made? Therefore, we need to change course. It requires a certain level of emotional intelligence, that you don't fall in love with your ideas even when they are not yielding the results you had hoped to achieve. You've got to have maturity enough for you to recognize that that decision was not optimal. There it needs to be changed accordingly. So some leaders, they do what we call management by walking around to get the sense of how things are going. This is another way of also influencing the culture within the organization. When you walk around and observe and talk to low level employees, you get a lot of feedback that then you incorporate in crafting or adapting your strategy to change. In actual fact, companies that are good at execution, they are also good at changing or adapting, because when you execute, you get information quickly, either from employees or from your customers, or including your partners or strategic alliance partners. You get that feedback that then you incorporate in your decision making when you adapt your strategy. So the idea of management by walking around basically achieves multiple objectives. One is to give guidance to the employees as you walk around. Two, you get a lot of information, insights when you walk around. Three, you are also able to influence behaviors as well as culture, the norms of the organization as you are walking around, interacting with various individuals within the organization. You'd actually find that some companies even expect their senior leaders to hold workshops or training workshops as a way of communicating the expectations from management and instilling the values and the cultural norms that the company has set, given the environment or the desired behaviors that are required. This involves spending time with people at the company facilities, asking questions, listening to their opinions and concerns, and gathering first-hand information about how well the aspects of the strategy execution process are going. It's very important. Rather than just sitting in your office all the time, get out, interact with people, get first-hand information. So mobilizing the effort for excellence in strategy execution requires multiple actions. Treat employees as valued partners. If you treat employees as valued partners, you are instilling a sense of belonging and a sense of ownership, and they feel that they are part of getting this organization forward, and they have to bring their best skills to work, including, of course, driving the right behavior within the organization. You need to instill the spirit that energizes members or employees within the organization. Empower individuals to make decisions and take accountability of those decisions, which leads to fully engaged workforce. Come up with stretch objectives. Implement things like re-engineering where the processes are no longer optimal or efficient. Total quality management is important, especially if you are differentiating yourself on quality. But this is not only for companies that are differentiating themselves on quality. Even if you are delivering low cost, it should be quality at low cost. So companies will adopt things like Six Sigma, where they are monitoring quality or defects on the products that they are manufacturing. Today, even services companies are implementing Six Sigma as a way of eliminating fault throughout their processes when they are delivering that service. So continuous improvement, very important, which was made popular by the Japanese through their Kaizen process, which means continuous improvement. It implies that even employees themselves need to embark on continuous improvement when it comes to developing their skills. Use motivational techniques as well as compensation incentives to inspire, nurture a result-oriented work climate, in which case then you enforce high standards for the employees across the board. But you need to also celebrate company success, celebrate individuals who are doing well, who are living the values of the organization and are achieving the targets set during your strategy planning, or even when you reconfigure the organization or recalibrate your strategy, you adjust your targets given what you know now about the external environment or the conditions of the marketplace. The culture of an organization can be changed by top executive and upper management behaviors, by ceremonial events to honor exemplary employees, and by physical symbols that represent the new culture. So there you have it. The culture again needs to adapt to the changing environment, and you need to analyze, use good business judgment in deciding what actions to take. And of course, implementation will always be key. Implement and implement, especially when it comes to culture, because small signals here and there communicates a very strong message. And it is important then that leaders are aware of their behavior too, which is what we call social intelligence. Way back we talked about IQ, and then we realized that we need something more than just an IQ, which is your pure intelligence. Then we discover that we need emotional intelligence. Why did we need emotional intelligence? Because we realize when you manage teams, you need feedback, and how you handle that feedback, especially if it's negative feedback, but we should say constructive feedback. You should have enough emotional intelligence to handle that feedback accordingly and use it as an insight in your subsequent decision making process. Today, we also need social intelligence. You need to know what is your impact on others. We have all these technologies now that we are using on a daily basis. If you go into a meeting with your phone, you are sending a particular message. You may not be consciously aware of the message, but people are watching and observing. If mid-sentence you pick your phone to check whether you've received a message, you are simply communicating a message to those in the meeting that whatever is being discussed is not important enough to hold your attention. There are other things out there that are also important that you want to be in touch with. But that is wrong. You went into that meeting to address a specific issue. Leave your phone or switch it off. So all of these things, they reflect your social intelligence, your impact on others. The culture of an organization can be changed by top executive and upper management behaviors, as we say, by adopting all these elements that we have discussed. A final word on leading the process of crafting and executing strategy. It is difficult to separate leading the process of executing strategy from leading the strategy process. They are very much intertwined. So you can't say, now I'm leading strategy process later and then say, now I'm getting into the process of executing strategy. They are intertwined. In actual fact, when you go for planning, that's already part of strategy execution process, because the strategy that you come up with, the targets that you set, the decisions on resources, it's already an integral part of strategy execution. That's already informing whether that strategy will get executed or not. So crafting, implementing, and executing strategy, it's a continuous process that requires much adjusting and fine-tuning of the strategy to fit these changing circumstances. We've been talking about this factor throughout the course, that circumstances change in the marketplace. Therefore, your strategy needs to be adjusted, fine-tuned to match that, so that you have a, well, it can't be a perfect fit, but it's got to be close to perfect. The test of strategy leadership are whether the company has a good strategy and business model, how you positioned yourself. But don't forget that strategy and the business model, they are also subjected to changes in the macroeconomic environment. So when you have performance targets, especially financial targets, you are not meeting those, you are not reaching those targets, perhaps it means you need to adjust your strategy. But there comes a time where you keep on adjusting and you are not getting positive results. It may just mean that your business model now is tired, needs to be reconfigured, not just adjusting, not just fine tuning. It means now you need an overhaul of your business model. Just the same way you do for your car. You have a service, you service your car regularly, but there comes a time when you need an engine overhaul. The business model is no different. It's the engine of the company. So at some stage it needs an overhaul. Whether it's a strategy is whether the company's strategy is competently executed and whether the company is achieving its performance target. Those are the indicators that tells you that your strategy or your business model needs to change. If these conditions exist, then the company has a good strategic leadership and it is very well managed. But you cannot relax. The cycle will repeat, or the process will repeat. Things will change in the macroeconomic environment. You reach maturity, which means now you have to come up with a strategy to stimulate the next wave of growth before you go into a decline. We've looked at a couple of examples, companies like Nokia and Kodak. They battled when they reached the decline phase to come up with ideas that will now drive a new growth path. Hence, they failed dismally. You don't want to do that. That is the role of a leader in driving strategy.